Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Well, welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. It is good to have you with us for another conversation in this week's episode. If you have been encouraged by this podcast, or if you have any feedback for us on this podcast or any of the episodes that you've heard or the conversations that you've tuned into, I want to invite you to email ask@thesowerspod.ca. Also, if you have any ideas as far as future themes, future conversations, people that I should be interviewing, would you go ahead and once again email ask@thesowerspod.ca, as I would love to hear from you. Well, the theme for today's conversation is marriage and family life in the middle of church planting. In order to have this conversation, I reached out to friends of mine named Bert and Sheila Thomson, who've been doing this for so long. Bert and Sheila reflect upon the journey in their marriage, leading their family, and planting churches, as well as reflecting on what moves or geographically moving from place to place, the impact that that had upon their marriage and family life. I believe you'll fall in love with Bert and Sheila as you hear them share honestly about this, as I have deeply fallen in love with this couple as well. Bert and Sheila serve Every Nation GTA, a church in downtown Toronto, and they're part of Every Nation Ministries. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a little bit. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Bert and Sheila Thomson. Well, Bert and Sheila, I am very excited to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time. As we begin, could you share how long you've been married?
Well, we were married 38 years as of April, so I guess 38 and a half years.
38 and a half years. And in that time, how many churches have you planted?
Well, I started first because I was on a church planting team even before Bert and I got married. But after that,
Calgary,
helped with a site plant in Nashville
and Toronto. And we're helping with a new church plant now here in Waterloo.
As you reflect now, as you're sitting here with me on that 38-year journey of marriage, as you think about these different churches that you've been a part of, could each of you share one thing that you are just so incredibly grateful for in that entire process?
Well, I think to start off with, I think one thing I'm grateful for is that through all of it, we've been in it together. We knew from early on in our marriage that this was the journey we were both committed to, that God had called us to pastor, to plant churches, and now later in life to help church planters. So we knew our hearts were in the same place. We were facing the same direction on this journey. And
for you, Bert?
I've had this question asked a lot, like even at the YMCA the other day, chatting with someone, or saying, you've lived in these different cities, Vancouver, Calgary, Nashville, Toronto, Kitchener, Waterloo. Which one did you like best? They always ask that question, and I hate answering it. Because I think one of the things when you're following the call of God, He somehow puts a love in your heart for wherever He sends you. And you think, okay, I really love this place. We're really getting to love this place more and more as you experience it. And then, when God calls you away from it, you think, but I got to get used to this new place. And you do. But it's amazing how over time that the Lord puts a deep love for that new place, the new people, and the new experiences.
So for you, it's this gratitude of the places that you've been and what God's done in your heart as far as helping you to love the city, the people, the culture of the places that you've been in.
Yeah, and I don't think when people ask that question who haven't moved a lot, because we had a lot of people are born and raised in the same place, they can't imagine what that would be like.
Sheila, you touched on something there that I think is important to explore for church planners, for ministry leaders, which is from the very beginning, you both had a sense of this is what God has invited us to or is calling us to. How did you both arrive to that calling? That was, as far as it related to Bert and Sheila Thomson, more specific than you're invited as followers of Jesus to build the kingdom of God, but the two of you uniquely were being positioned by God to be called into church planting.
I know for certain, even before Bert and I were married, even before I met Bert, I had a sense in my heart, first, that my life wasn't my own, so I was willing to hear what God had for me. And then that there was going to be, at some point in my life, some measure of full-time ministry. So even before Bert and I were ever married, I did some campus ministry. I worked with international students. I was on a church planting team in Vancouver. So I had a sense in my own heart that God had something for me to do. Then Bert and I met and married, and that was probably, even as we were getting to know one another, it was part of the attraction. It was not just were we falling in love and all the romantic part of it, but we also saw that one another felt the same passion and call in our hearts to serve God.
And how about for you, Bert?
Yeah, I want to echo something Sheila said. There is was an attraction. I saw that she was a leader. She was on a church planting team. 10 people moved from Kitchener-Waterloo to Vancouver, to UBC. I was a student there. So I knew what type of person she was. She was someone who was all in for God. And so I was the fruit of that church plant outreach. I was the one who gave my life fully to the Lord through that church planting team's efforts, and then quickly was raised up as a leader and felt that this was going to be my destiny. And so it was that sense of I needed someone who felt that, and I saw that, and she needed someone who felt that as well. And by God's grace, it just never was it was just so settled ahead of time that this is what I was going to do. And because it was settled that was what she was going to do, we decided we'd do it together. And at our wedding, we actually had a song, and one of the lines was, we'll share our destinies and together do much more than either one of us could do alone.
I was just recently at a church planting assessment retreat, and we had 7 couples there, and an entire session. And then, as you both know, a lot of the individual sessions with each of the church planting couples, some of them separate so that assessors can hear them individually, is spent talking about calling and is spent talking about the health of their marriage. We will say that if your marriage is not healthy, it's very unlikely that the church, as time goes on, will not be healthy, and that the church will fail. And even if you feel like the church has been successful, but your marriage has failed in the process, oh my goodness, what a sacrifice. What are the things that you have done over the years? You've obviously had this strong sense of calling, that you're called to be part of church planting, but what are the things that you knew that you needed to invest in your marriage over time to keep things well? And I'm sure there weren't always great seasons. So maybe Sheila, start talking as answering that question.
We're pretty good at spending time together. Now, anybody with small kids knows that looks different at different times in life, but we definitely, whether it's sitting in the morning and having a cup of coffee together, or even to this day, we will drop our work at about 3:00 in the afternoon and hop in the car and go out and get a coffee. Even if it's those, 30-minute connection in the morning and again at night, we're definitely good at grabbing those moments to spend time together. When it doesn't all circle around coffee, but when we were in Nashville and Bert's job, his his plate was pretty full, he'd capture a little bit of time during the day, and he'd text or call and say, "Hey, I've got an hour," and he'd show up on the door, and we'd head to a Starbucks or something. That we'd have those moments of connection. I know, in the Christian world, we talk about date nights. It's never been a huge part of who we are. We were always more conscious of the fact that day in, day out, we needed to make connection with one another.
So is the daily, as far as a discipline of practice, it's daily connecting with one another. And I'm assuming some of those times together were, okay, how are you? And then other times are like, how are you really?
And
Would
how
that be
are
true?
the kids? And,
Yeah.
Something comes up, one of us has a conversation with one of the kids. Well, then we've got that time when it's fresh to talk about it and make a bit of a game plan. And so I think that the regular daily connection.
Yeah, is important. How about for you, Bert, over the 38 and a half?
Yeah, I want to go a little bit different direction. To have a healthy marriage, I think you have to be healthy yourself. And one of the things that both of us have always had is hobbies. We get into something. For a while, I was into golf a lot, and then I got into marathon running and joined a marathon running club for many years. And then more recently, I got into lawn care, where I'm really into, like, I have a mower from England that I paid a lot of money for, and I'm really obsessive on my lawn. She's always had hobbies too. And then it just makes you just a more of a whole person. And then there's some things we enjoy together. And, I just felt like that first answer of, we're so passionate for Jesus. So it's all true, but there's something really practical, about God's world, just to be a healthy individual. And I see, some couples, all they talk about is ministry. Their social media is only ministry. I hardly have a ministry thing on my social media. It's usually just what I'm into right there in my lawn, or helping out with the neighborhood rink in the winter. I really enjoy that. And then there's some things that together we've learned to sort of share one another's interest over time. So she loves baseball. I like baseball, but because she likes it so much, then we'll go to a Blue Jays game, or we'll watch it a lot on TV. It's usually in the background all summer, every day. It's like we don't necessarily sit down and watch the whole thing. But, she can rattle off the names of all of the players. And because she's so into it, I can kind of get into it too. And then there's some things that she does, like crocheting, that I've never really got into.
So there's this element of daily connection, relationship connection in that sense. And then there's also, hey, in order for your relationship to be healthy, you personally need to be healthy. And part of that is developing hobbies, outlets. As you think back over the years, think of a season that was difficult. What was going on in that season? There were probably mistakes that either of you made. Maybe some of our listeners are in the middle of that right now. So share with us lessons from a difficult season, what could have been changed in the moment, and maybe a message of hope to those that might be in the middle of that season right now.
I think probably in hindsight, not in the middle of it, but in hindsight, we had difficult years. In Nashville, there were some things that were more challenging on the family front. And that was probably the season of our lives where we were actually less engaged with one another. And Bert was working full-time in the church, and I was pretty much a full-time mom. And sometimes then the distance there would grow. We weren't necessarily as in touch with our teenage children as what now in hindsight we wish we would have been. I think, the busyness of ministry, if we could turn back the clock, we would probably have said no to more things. So that was a tough season, I think. But in hindsight, in the middle of something, you're busy and life looks like it's good. And then you see the toll that it's had on you or your kids, your marriage.
When you think back to that time, Bert, at that time you were the one in more full-time work and Sheila was at home. What are some of the lessons you learned in that season that have maybe shifted your perspective from then to today?
Oh, man. There's a certain age and maybe certain times in your ministry where things are going really, really well. I wasn't busy because we were not seeing success, but we were seeing huge success. Scores of people were getting saved at the church. Our North American headquarters office, which I was kind of the key administrator there, was growing. We were adding staff like crazy. Our ministry globally was starting to really expand. When I say we, the whole Every Nation family of churches and ministries. And so what's odd is, like, from a ministry perspective, it was some of the greatest years of fruitfulness, of unbelievable blessing from God. Even some of us who worked together in Nashville at that time, who are now, have planted churches in other places and gone our separate ways, and that when we get together, we just marvel at that season of just God's grace being poured out in amazing ways. But at the same time, that was the time where I guess I wasn't as in touch with my kids, and it's a funny thing, you're so swept up in the good thing that God's doing that you just don't have the same fine-tunement to your own children somehow. It wasn't bad things that were keeping me away from being more of a listening dad. It was actually good things. And I don't know how exactly you, when you're in the middle of that, navigate, but it's hard.
You have 4 children, and so you've moved quite a bit. Talk to transitioning your family from one place to another, especially places that have quite a bit of distance from one thing to another. What are some of your lessons in that process?
Boy, this could be a long one. Some of our lessons. So when we moved from Vancouver to Calgary, we had a 2.5-year-old and a 7-month-old. And, in my youthful exuberance and bliss and ignorance, I thought that a 2-year-old, you hear kids are resilient. So I didn't have any concept that this would have any effect on a 2-year-old. And yet, when we moved to many years later, when we moved from Vancouver to Calgary, our son didn't understand why someone who had been living with us in Vancouver didn't move with us. And he would ask why we left her behind. He was also having trouble figuring out why God, and he called our pastor by name, Pastor Brian, why God and Pastor Brian made us move to Calgary. And we thought it's a cute little 2-year-old. And but in hindsight, with subsequent moves and seeing the effects on our kids, we realized we hadn't even handled the emotional needs of our little guy as well as what we could have. So definitely that move. Do you want to, Bert, talk about the move to we lived in Calgary for 9 years, then we moved to Nashville. So our kids, when we moved to Nashville, were 11, 9, and 6.
Yeah, and a mistake was we moved quickly. We had the offer to go to Nashville and to help there. That was in July when one of our co-founders was visiting us and preaching in our church in Calgary and gave us that invitation and suggestion, and we resonated with it. We felt our time was coming to an end. But I can't remember the time frame. He visited us in July. When did we move?
August 18th.
Yeah, that's pretty quick.
Our kids were troopers. They were great, everybody. They were great kids, and they were flexible, and they went along for the ride, and we called it the Grand Adventure. And but it wasn't until the next move, when our then adult children began to process out loud with us some of the pain of their moves, especially the older two when they were 11 and 9. So they began to talk about how hard that transition was, leaving friends behind and feeling like they didn't fit in a new city and a new country. And, as Canadians, we think, Canadians and Americans were so similar. Well, no, Canadians don't think that. Maybe Americans do. But our kids definitely felt the difference. the way they pronounced words, the things they were interested in. And other kids aren't always kind. So we, even in the midst of that, because it was a quick move for Bert and I, we probably didn't process our own change and loss and grief very well. And as an adult, if you don't do that well yourself, you don't help your kids along on the journey, but again, it was fast, and we didn't even, everybody just kind of pulled up their socks and we did what we needed to do. And it really wasn't till years later that we've had really good conversations with our adult children, which actually helped prepare us for the move back to Canada from Nashville.
Yeah, maybe I'll comment on that move. But first, there were rays of light. I can remember our eldest, we were in an apartment, and it wasn't even sure that we were going to be in Nashville at the original move. We weren't sure. We were thinking it might have been our church in North Carolina for a while, because it was supposed to be like a sabbatical break and then figure out what the next step. So it was supposed to be a transition. But so as we were, packing up our minivan and pulling a trailer behind, we actually didn't know exactly where we were going to go. So we just started driving across the country, and we visited my grandmother, and
hence the great adventure that you mentioned.
Yeah, the great adventure, and went across Canada, and it's like, and we're trying to explain, to parents, like, where are you moving exactly? Well, maybe North Carolina, maybe Tennessee, maybe back to Canada after that. So it's like we didn't really know. But I can remember our eldest one time when we finally landed in Nashville, and we had our first apartment there. And he told me and he told the other kids, we're kind of like Abraham. He said God told him to go out, not knowing exactly where he was to go, but he was to follow him. And so there was little places where God intervened in our kids' life. So it's not all one or all the other. So there was some good points where God did minister to the hearts of our kids.
This was the same child in around that time that also told us, I guess we've joined the ranks of the homeless. So you can see that the struggle within an 11-year-old to have a sense that we were being like Abraham, but to still not feel rooted.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Bert and Sheila Thomson in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Every Nation Churches and Ministries. Every Nation Churches and Ministries is a global family of churches with one foot on the campus and one foot in the community. Since 1994, Every Nation missionaries and church planners have answered the call to bring the gospel to campuses and cities around the world. They plant churches that reach the campus because they firmly believe that if we change the campus, they will eventually change the family, the nation, and the world. If you want to learn more about Every Nation Churches and Ministries, you can visit everynation.org. Once again, that is everynation.org. And now back to my interview with Bert and Sheila Thomson. So speak to the pastor, the family, the church planner that's out there. They have a family, and they are sensing that there's a new thing coming, or maybe they've already gotten the offer. Maybe they're already even in it. How would you want to pastor them to pastor and love their family well in this season?
I'd like to start on that one because we did do it much better on child 4. So there is hope.
Okay.
Just have enough kids. But I can remember our youngest, we were still in Nashville. So there's a couple things. One is that I took it slower. I wanted them to be in finishing their school years, things like that. So it would have been a great delay, and it was a great challenge because I had a severance package that was running out, and I was going back onto full missionary support for the church plant in Toronto. So it was a scary thing to do because economically it'd be better to get there faster while I still have income. But I made a decision to go slow. And so I went back and forth. I made 16 trips to Toronto for weekend ministry to try to get things started because there was already a core team there. A little church had already emerged. So that was a step of faith. And during that time, I can remember our youngest laying on the couch. He's very outgoing personality, probably the most extroverted out of our 4 kids. And he was very sullen, and he was on the couch. And I just said, hey, hey, little buddy, you okay? He said, I'm okay, Dad. I'm just grieving the loss of what this move means. And I thought, wow, I think this is much better. Somehow he had figured out through how we were treating him that he would need to grieve the loss of his friends and the move along the way.
And that was from conversation. That was from being willing to talk. He and I would talk on the way to and from school. I drove him, and I introduced the word grief to him. And I talked about my own grieving and what I was really going to miss about my life in Nashville. And I talked about the people I was going to miss, and then he'd talk about the people he was going to miss. But we'd also talk about things that might be exciting about, even when he was 10 and 11, before we had moved. Well, what might be exciting about living in another country? Because he's our American-born child, and he'd visited Canada a lot, and he actually was excited about living here. So it was actually learning with him that it was all right with a kid to be able to talk about both those things. One didn't discredit the other. I can be really excited about something, and I can also find it really scary. So I think the conversations we had with him, but also with our adult children at the time, because the other three were older, I think the talking and being honest about what we were feeling, not just saying, well, God's called us to do this, so, everything's going to be okay. No, sometimes it's hard and it hurts and there's loss involved.
So it's having those intentional conversations. It's going slow. Would there be anything else that you'd encourage?
I would say if you do this, it really works. So I want to speak some hope into this situation. So talking to each of our adult children, I knew that they would find it hard, and we felt that the oldest two would probably stay in the States, which they did, which that was hard. We knew that this move back to Canada was in some ways going to be the hardest because we had always moved together as a family, and this move would split the family. So we knew it was going to be a big one. But talking to our kids, the older ones, just one-on-one, as their dad, I did this one. I said, if this is too much pain, then we'll call off the move. We're not going to put the ministry before you. And I said that to each of them. And it's interesting that even with their negative experiences and that they had, the older ones, and it was so redemptive for them to be able to say, I remember our oldest telling me, it's going to be really hard. We'll miss you. But Dad, you're born for this. Dad, it's time for you to get back in the lead role and do this. And to have your adult son speak over your destiny to move forward. I live for those are the highlight moments of life.
How about for you, Sheila?
I think one of the other conversations we've had with that same son, who isn't a kid anymore, he's almost 37, is, did we make every move perfectly? Well, you've just heard a little bit of it. We could tell more. But our son is very successful, and he's also taken some risks in life. And more than once, he said, what I've learned from you, Mom and Dad, is that it's all right to take a risk, to step out kind of in that, we like to, say step out in faith or step out into something that's uncertain. And as Bert said, huge compliments from adult children. But I know our kids have watched. We've moved. God's been there for us. And I think that's probably the greatest thing for each of our kids, to see that it's okay.
Wow. I would love for you to speak to over the different seasons of ministry. It sounds like in Vancouver, the very beginning, Sheila, you were there, you were part of the team, you're one of the leaders. You then fall in love and you're part of that. And then you move to Calgary, you're doing that together, but I'm sure that, you're introducing, you have young kids, you end up having 4 children. Talk about the ebbs and flows of your roles in the different ministries over the year and how you stayed united. Now, I'm sure there wasn't perfect seasons of being united. I know, speaking from my own relationship, as soon as we started having kids, my wife ended up taking a bit more of really a congregation member. How have you stayed united as leaders in your churches?
Definitely, as your wife, as you said about your wife, my role has changed over the years. Sometimes it was a congregation member. In a church plant, that's a pretty hard thing to do because we started in our home and in our living room. So it was preparing to have people into our house a couple of times a week and hosting a small group and being the first one to disciple. We were on a college or university campus, so being the first one to disciple the young women who were coming into the church. So I definitely had a part to play, even with small children in the home. But it's, from our early years when we were first married to me being hands-on while we were both working full-time and having small groups and discipling, working with people, to being a little busier on the home front. And then now being virtually empty nesters, I'm full-time working with our church, but also with other Every Nation churches and church plants. So it definitely comes and changes and looks a little different.
And how did you stay not cynical, not frustrated through those ebbs and flows? Because there is a reality that, well, Bert, it looks different for you. So how did you stay sane and trusting in God in those different seasons?
That's a good question. I think, did I always? Probably not. Stay sane. I think we go back to both of us having that sense of call before we ever married one another, that God was going to use us, and in a vocational ministry sense. And from assessing church planters, how vital that is, no matter what the wife's role is going to be within the church, whether she's got a full-time profession, career, or whether she's somewhat or a whole lot engaged in the church. Both husband and wife really need to know at their core that this is what they're supposed to be doing, because hard times come. And when the hard times come, when I know it's not just Bert's word from God to do something, but it's what God's spoken to my own heart, that carries me. It protects me from resentment and bitterness and going dark on why did you make us move? No, we've moved together wholeheartedly, both known we were supposed to move forward in whatever ministry looked like at that time.
And what your role would be as a mom. The other thing Sheila did is she was very creative to keep in the ministry. So she would disciple girls along the way, but she would have the babies in tow and take them out onto campus or whatever. And actually, these young ladies actually got a model of motherhood along the way. It wasn't a negative. So sometimes you think that kids and family are negative to ministry. Sometimes, seeing the family, young people seeing the family or having them into your home, rather than you go out on campus, now you have to have them come into your home. And
we have definitely used our home a lot over the years. Definitely been invited lots of people in and let them just be.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the things where, and I don't know if she was just creative or being led by the Lord or whatever, but she's always had a way of having some level of ministry impact in the lives of others, no matter what. And so, but she was also understanding that it had to be different and creative in times, and sometimes from a time point of view, it was limited.
Bert, how have you loved, nourished, cherished, uplifted, supported Sheila over the years?
Wow. Wow, I thought she would have to answer that one. But, I think I've always affirmed, her, who she is, that I do love her, but also the gifts and callings on her life. I do speak that over her, even just today, because she's preaching this Sunday. And when we were off to the YMCA, we go there a few mornings a week. I said to her, I think you've had so many reps preaching now, you're getting really good. And you don't have to prep quite so long. And so I think sometimes just along the way, some compliments. I think in general, we probably don't verbalize as much as we should. Those things I think it's the downside. But I think that when we do speak good things over one another, I think that's one of the ways of just bringing that life. And I think you use the word cherish.
How have you seen Bert love, care, nourish, cherish, uplift you over the years that has been, as you look back and even in the present, think on that, you say, man, I wish more men were doing that in the lives of their wives?
Boy, another one we could talk a lot about, but I think Bert's allowed me to go places in ministry that, sometimes the church is still trying to figure out where women fit in the church. And Bert's let me step into things and try things and affirmed me in those places. Also made time for me, to whether it's, to do mentorship and discipleship and meet with women, even when the kids were younger. If I had a Bible study, with students on campus, he'd be there to make the dinner and help with the kids. And there wasn't quite as much, well, no, you can slip that in your free time. No, I'm going to help you explore who God's created you to be. He's been very supportive in letting me figure out who I am and how God wants to use my gifts.
You have both been part of church planters assessments, lots of people in ministry. You're currently coaching, loving on a network of church planters and leaders. As you have surveyed that landscape and learned from those experiences, what are a couple of things that maybe right now in this time in our country, you're maybe identifying as similar situations in multiple places? What are you thinking and praying about right now as you've surveyed the landscape, or that there's couples listening to this, they need to prioritize right now? Like what are two of those things?
One, and I'll also speak to church planting networks, because this area of marriage and family blindsides a lot of people. We had a couple that we're close to that planted in a city in the U.S., and we have pretty good assessment, training, boot camp, coaching, consulting systems. But they landed there after making a major move with their kids that are younger. And they said, why didn't anybody tell us that the hardest thing of the church plant would be with our kids and family? They didn't even consider it. And so that would be one thing I would say that we have to be more intentional about. And I think it's really just that heart cry for planters. It's a lonely, hard job. There is no doubt about it. It takes all your faith. It takes all your energy. It's exciting, yes. But our planters need real support, real spiritual moms and dads who give their ear, who pour in their heartfelt concern, go there, sit in those planters' homes and support them. We're so good at the assessment and the launch, but it's that after sales support and service. If you want to use, I'm just being a little funny there, but that I would say that if I were just speaking to networks right now, and it can't just be kind of on a checklist of a phone call once a month. It's got to be heartfelt. It's got to be sincere. Those people who are doing that have really got to be, if you use New Testament language, as a father to you in the gospel, really spiritual fathers and mothers.
We were in Winnipeg just a couple of weeks ago and sitting at breakfast with a church planting couple there in our network. And over breakfast, I don't even know how it came up, but the pain that pastors feel when they've poured into someone and that family or couple or individual left the church. And, there's a place where pastors are supposed to kind of grin and bear it. And yet there aren't a lot of places where you can look at someone who understands and says, this really hurts. Maybe it's, I can't remember exactly. I think it's Ed Stetzer talked about the team you plant with. They're probably not going to be the same people who are with you 5 years later. And you can say that kind of just as an analytical statement, but the fact is that we give our hearts to people as pastors. So there are places where there's pain in ministry that we need places that we can look somebody in the eye and say, there are things that really hurt. And there are things we're not sure what to do with our feelings and our emotions. We just go on. So I think some of that deep camaraderie and emotional support, the strength that we can gain from one another, from people who walk in your shoes.
And I thought the greatest thing I would do on the weekend would be
when we were in Winnipeg.
Yeah, and I did preach great, but, or meet with the board or all of those things. But I remember just with that couple and when she was just sharing the pain of some real close people had left. And all I could do is really grab her hand and look her in the eyes and say, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. And it's interesting that out of, all the things we did, the thing that was so monumental to them was that little moment of acknowledging the pain of ministry, that you have someone with their own battle scars and can look her in the eye and say, I'm so sorry, and know that pain.
So what would your word then be to potential planters, current planters? Hey, here are a couple of blind spots. You need to be aware of these things. Don't be surprised when they come. And there's always a part, as you know, in church planting couples, like, it's not going to be like that for us. I'll keep those core people. I'll be the first church that keeps every core person 5 years later. But what are the things you just would want them to know and be prepared for and to prioritize in their lives in this season?
I think definitely some of it is relationships outside of your church planting team, your local church. I definitely know there's power to friendships with other church planters, other denominations, other couples. Maybe it's not who you spend time with every week, but you've got somebody on speed dial, so to speak, that you can not just coaching on how to, do a better Sunday service, but that personal and emotional support.
What would it be for you, Bert?
To me, it would be, you just need to persevere. At the end of the day, it's really, we're coming into Christmas and everybody's, favorite Christmas movie, Die Hard. There's a sense I've looked at different church planters and I've looked at them. I said, do you know why you're going to succeed or why you're succeeding? And I just look at them because you're Die Hard. It's like you just refuse to quit. And I think that is really, to me, the whole game of church planting. It's, can you persevere through to the end? He who perseveres to the end, shall be saved. That mentality, it's not going to look like, it's going to be hard. It's not going to look like what you want. But I would say that one quality will get you to the other side.
And then you see the beauty and you see the areas, then you're not lost for what God's actually doing in your church plant, the new believers, the growth in people's lives. You're not, if you persevere, you get to see some really beautiful, fun things that God lets you be a part of.
One more thing I would say on the perseverance, it's you're doing it as unto the Lord. Your ego is going to be challenged, especially if you come from a fairly successful church with, maybe a bigger size, more ministry impact. I think God's will work you over. Can you work in obscurity and faithfulness to Him? And I see a lot of, over the years, where I've seen church planters come and go, and really at the crux of it was they just weren't having enough success to keep going. And if success is what we're after, then we're after the wrong thing. We're just after the wrong thing. It may not be the church that you wanted, but it might be the church that God wanted. And so I think the two areas where you get worked over in church planting is definitely in your marriage. If there's a crack, the pressure of church planting makes it more evident. It reveals it. But I think the other thing is ego and what success looks like. And I've had to wake myself up many times on a Monday morning and think, I just thought we'd be a lot further along by now. And it's because I've been in ministry situations that had a lot more what we would call quote unquote success.
Bert and Sheila, I want to thank you both for taking the time today, from speaking so honestly and authentically from your experience, and being now father and mother to many, many people across our country. So thank you. Well, friends, I was deeply challenged by this conversation with the Thomsons, as I'm sure you were as you were listening to it. For this episode's action step, I want to invite you to reflect deeply and in prayer on your relationship right now with your spouse and with your family. This conversation may have brought up situations or past experiences in your mind, and I'd simply invite you to consider those experiences, to even consider at present your current relationship with your spouse and your relationship with your kids. Are there ways in which you are sacrificing your marriage and your family on the altar of your ministry, forgetting that your family is the first ministry that you have been called to? This is deeply, deeply important, for if your relationship with your spouse and your relationship with your kids is not good, your church will not flourish, and you are not setting before them an example to follow. I pray that as you do this reflection, that you would lean upon the grace of God, and that you would have then meaningful conversations with your spouse and with your family. Thanks again, everyone, for joining this episode, for listening to this conversation. I'm now going to play a clip from my conversation in next week's episode with Kesavan Balasingham.
And I don't really remember the Bible study that he did, because my mind was preoccupied with asking him a number of questions. So after the study, I walked up to him and I said, hey, listen, I'm a Hindu. I don't know about this whole conversion thing. I don't know what that means. But I've been reading the Bible, and I want to know the God of the Bible is a personal God, is a loving God, is a forgiving God, and it's a God who can take someone like me and save me, change me, and use me. Like, is that what I'm reading here?